Good afternoon. My name is Kara. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program coordinator at the Partnership for the National Trail System, or PNTS. Thank you for joining us today. The Partnership for the National Trail System is proud to present today's webinar, Land Acquisition 101, that will cover how to begin the land acquisition process, what the process entails, how LWCF money can be utilized in collaboration with your agency partners, what the role of a land trust is in the land acquisition process, and how you can work alongside land trusts for successful acquisition. I will be serving as today's webinar moderator, and I will be monitoring the chat. Okay. Give me 1 second. As we get started, I would like to say that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Seneca, or Onondaga, and Haudenosaunee people. PNTS recognizes that land acknowledgements are an important first step to acknowledge that we are on stolen Indigenous lands. I've provided a link in the chat where you can explore what native lands you currently reside on. Please enter into the chat what lands you are joining us from. And as folks do that, I'll continue on. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Partnership for the National Trail System, PNTS is the only nationwide nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the extraordinary value of America's national scenic and historic trails. We do so by providing the private partners associated with each trail with resources to enhance their advocacy, professional trail skill sets, volunteer engagement, and nurturing of future conservationists. We promote and support the efforts of the National Scenic and Historic Trail organizations to secure public and private resources and to serve as a collective voice for policy and action that supports national scenic and historic trails. I want to introduce today's presenters, JT Horn from the Trust for Public Land and Joe Sobinovsky, Realty Specialist at the National Park Service. Additionally, I will mention that this webinar is being recorded. The presentation will go for about 30 minutes, but we will pause a little bit more than halfway through the presentation. And if there are any questions at that time of what's been covered so far, and then there'll be about 30 minutes at the end for question and answers as well. Feel free to please put any questions you may have into the chat as we go, so you don't forget any questions, or you can add them during the question and answer time. And with that, I'd like to hand it off to JT Horn from the Trust for Public Land to get us started.
Great. Kara, can you stop sharing, and I will start sharing, and we'll pull up the slides here. Let's see. Do slideshow from the beginning. There we go. All right. Kara, can you see the slides okay? Great.
Yes, all set.
All right. So I work for the Trust for Public Land. We're a national nonprofit land conservation organization. We're based in San Francisco, and we work all across the country. So my job is to actually do land acquisition work, but I also coordinate our national strategy for trails. And so the Trust for Public Land's mission is land for people. And so we put a really high priority on protecting land that will make communities stronger places to live, work, and visit. And trails are oftentimes a big part of that. So our most recent strategic plan has made a commitment to protect 1,000 miles of trails in 50 communities across the US. And to break that down, we've sort of developed some themes. And one is urban and suburban work. We do a lot of work in cities. We're doing a lot of work in small towns, particularly around mountain biking and community forest type properties. And those are really exciting opportunities to draw new tourism, to revitalize rural economies that oftentimes were dependent upon timber or mining or agriculture, which are oftentimes shedding jobs. And we've also made an explicit commitment to the National Trail System. We've historically done work along the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, North Country, Alakahakai, a lot of the different trails in the system. And those have been really wonderful success stories for us, working side by side with some of the trail stewardship groups and some of the federal agencies. And so our work is very explicitly geared towards trail protection, and particularly along the national trail system. And so that's what we wanted to talk about, how that all plays out on a typical land acquisition. So we're going to talk about 4 things today. What are the precursors for land acquisition, the final alignment for the trail route, and the land acquisition work. What does it look like for a federal agency to do that? And Joe is going to talk us through that from the National Park Service perspective, where he's a realty specialist. We're going to talk a little bit about how that works outside of the federal system, including working with your local land trusts or with a state agency or municipal government. And then the final piece will be kind of walking you through, what does a successful land deal look like? What are the elements of success? So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you here to talk a little bit about kind of the planning side of things that you really need to have in place before you can go out and start acquiring property.
Yeah, thanks, JT. This process, of acquiring land, it starts with a planning process, and typically realty specialists like myself we are not involved in that. We're just here to get the process done of acquiring the land. So by the time a proposal comes to us, it should go through a process. The best practices is for everyone to agree on this parcel of land where it should be purchased. Something that's been used for years on the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest, and I know recently on other trails, is something called a optimal location review, where it's kind of a review process. It could be less difficult, or very detailed, or not so much. But the main purpose of that is for the trail manager, the ultimate owner. Sometimes if you're buying, the goal is to buy a parcel of land and convey it to the United States to manage. You're going to have some sort of a manager agree that they want to own this thing. So this OLR process is a good way to get there. You could go out in the field, do a few reviews, look at the topography and where it is the easiest place to buy land. Because again, what you don't want to do is buy land that in a few years from now, somebody's going to look back and say, well, what did you waste all that time for buying that land where you should have been on the other ridge across on the other side? So that would help make sure you don't run into a problem like that you do get everyone agrees. You would have the nonprofit agree on this with a signature page in the back. So the current manager at the time, the current nonprofit, and any other advocates or shareholders could be involved in that, and just agree that that's what you all agree that should be acquired. And then once you do that, there's different ways. You actually have to proceed with the mapping of this. And JT, I think, mentioned that TPL, the last bullet there, said TPL can help with that if you don't have that capability. But that's at the earliest stages anyway, is to get buy-in from everyone, and don't just assume that, that's the parcel you want to buy, unless it's of historic, unique historic or even geographic significance. If it's the only way up to the top of the mountain that you're supposed to be on, then of course you need that. But you should still take a look at that and agree before you proceed too far down the complicated and time-consuming land acquisition process. Agree early up front that everyone thinks that we should buy this first.
So Joe, I think this one is yours as well, talking about the acquisition authority.
Yeah, so if the ultimate goal is for a parcel of land to be somehow conveyed or donated or sold to the federal government, then that's a different process. So we first every trail has to have authority to acquire land, and the National Scenic and Historic Trails, they did receive willing seller authority some years back. So they do have the authority to acquire from willing sellers. The National Trail System Act is what we cite for that. So we have to, the first thing we do as a federal agency is we have to talk to an attorney, a solicitor, or a general counsel for the Department of Agriculture, and they have to give us the green light to go ahead and buy this land. So first we have to cite is that enabling legislation. And once we have that, then the most important thing of this whole process is that if you're, again, trying to get this to the federal government, you have to very early on in this process, make sure that you have what amounts to a willing buyer. You have to make sure that the land manager, the district ranger or the superintendent for National Park Service unit would want to own this and manage this land. So that's the beginning of the process. You would work with that superintendent of a trail, or I know Forest Service trails, some have trail managers, or in some cases it's different, some kind of a manager who's ultimately going to be managing that land has to agree to this. And there are different ways to do that. Our office has, I should explain, I work in the what's called a National Trails Land Resources Program Center in Martinsburg, West Virginia, which is the office that acquired the Appalachian Trails. So it's been here for going on, it's more than 40 years, acquired thousands of parcels to assemble the Appalachian Trails. So we have a lot of experience with linear corridor acquisitions. So we realized as the main acquisition for the Appalachian Trail is winding down, that we reached out to keep that expertise to work on other trails. And through a process, we could be assigned the work to work on any trail. And we've also worked on several, we now still have several National Park Service trails, as well as some Forest Service trails we've done work on. Bought millions of dollars worth of land on the Florida Trail and the Pacific Crest. So we could work through both Department of Agriculture or Interior, and we coordinate with BLM, Forest Service, Park Service to acquire land. So we come at no cost to anybody. We don't, so it wouldn't cost, like a superintendent of a trail with not a large budget could come to us and get us to work on this, and it wouldn't cost anything. But again, the first process is to get that manager to agree to own the land. The main way to get to something acquired for the National Park System, we have what's called a LARS process, land acquisition ranking system. So a superintendent would submit this request. It's like an internal grant process. It's usually about 2 years, or I think right now we're scoring the fiscal year 2023 submissions. So a couple years out. So this is not a quick process, but if you want to get land, you first have to get that superintendent to submit this request to get ranked, to request the funding to acquire the land. If it's a donation, it's a little different. Of course, you don't need that. There's no money involved. So that's just a different process. We won't go into the details now, but there's a way to do that as well. And then once the funding's approved and we have the money and we have a superintendent or a trail manager that's willing to acquire it, then they just notify our office, and then we would provide all the work that doesn't have to bog down that manager. So we'll take it from there, basically. So that's kind of a quick overview of the federal process. We work a lot with nonprofits like JT, and I know he's going to talk a lot more, because it's a great advantage for speed for us to work with someone like the Trust for Public Land. That JT knows my regulations better than I do, so he knows what we need, what we can do, what we can't do, and he keeps us out of trouble. So it really does help speed up the process if you could have a group like that would step in and try to get the process moving. But they can't do them all. JT's already overworked, but they're good. If you can get a partner like that would get started and get us moving much more rapidly than we move on our own.
Great. So that's the kind of the quick thumbnail on what it looks like to deal with a federal acquisition. For many of the trails, that may not be the optimal solution, or there may be local strategies that will work really well for protection. And on a lot of the trails, there's a mix of federal ownership and other types of ownership. You know, the federal agency may own the footpath location or an important cultural site, and then the view shed or you know, buffer lands might be owned by a variety of stakeholders. You know, state government, towns, local land trusts, et cetera. And so this section will be just kind of a quick thumbnail on how it works to deal with a local entity as opposed to a federal agency. There's pros and cons. Obviously, if you're looking out for your trail interest and you're dealing with a state agency or a local land trust, you have to make sure that the priorities align. So things like, you know, resource extraction, like timber or, you know, natural gas or fracking or things like that, you know, those can be areas of conflict. You know, hunting policies and things like that can be areas of conflict. And so I think you need to look at what are the management regime that you're dealing with whenever you're dealing with a local entity. The flip side of that is there can be incredible flexibility and creativity that sometimes federal agencies don't have. And so the types of easements that can be acquired, the types of real estate interests, working with a seller who's interested in only selling a portion of their property or just granting, you know, a limited set of rights. You know, you can figure this stuff out in a local context sometimes much easier. And the other thing is that sometimes these projects can go much quicker than going through the full federal acquisition process. The other thing to think about it is what's in it for the local land trust or what's in it for the local agency. And in general, as they're competing for funding and trying to raise money and protect land and fulfill their own conservation mission, saying that they're in alignment with a federal land unit or a federal congressionally designated trail is really powerful. It takes a sort of a plain vanilla forest parcel or plain vanilla farm parcel and turns it into something special. And I've done this over and over again in some of the work that I've done on the Appalachian Trail, where we take a regular town forest project and by saying we're doing it in partnership with the town and with the Appalachian Trail, it will really bump up its priority and really help it compete for funding. And then the other thing is that a lot of local organizations will have revolving funds and access to money that will allow them to go and acquire a property and take it off the open market and work really quickly. The big national groups like the Trust for Public Land, the Conservation Fund, the Nature Conservancy have this capability, but a lot of the locals do too. You know, generally they're looking for ways to deploy those funds for maximum effect. And that's where having, you know, a trail parcel that is immediately threatened, you might say, look, I have a 2-year process ahead of me to deal with a federal agency, but I might be able to find a local trust who's willing to act a lot quicker than that and to put some of their capital to work. So if you are going the local route, there's a lot of funding options, too many to get into here. But this is the photo on the slide is in Hawaii of the Lwcf National Historic Trail. And one of the things I love about this story is that they've used a real mix of strategies to protect that trail. So they have some National Park Service ownership, but they have a lot of county or state ownership as well, where they're basically buying productive agricultural lands, ranch lands, and using farm funding sources to do that, and also protecting the trail at the same time. Each state is going to be different. There's literally thousands of local funding sources that are created through, you know, municipal appropriations or state bonds or sales taxes, things like that. Your local land trust is going to know how all that works in whatever jurisdiction they operate in. There's also the state side of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So the LWCF is sort of the anchor funding source for most federal conservation programs. But there's also a state side, which is where the Park Service grants out to states and to municipalities up to 50% of the cost of an acquisition. So if you're looking to partner with state government or local government, Having an LWCF grant for up to 50% can be pretty powerful. And there's synergy between the recreational requirements of an LWCF acquisition and a National Scenic or a National Historic Trail. Obviously, there's private gifts, local fundraising campaigns. I think the big message is that unlike the federal process where generally the Park Service or Forest Service can just buy something and 100% of the money would come from LWCF from the federal agency, typically these local projects are going to assemble a whole bunch of different funding sources and they're all leveraged against each other. No one funder wants to pick up the whole price tag. Typically you need to build what we would call a funding stack. And a lot of Trust for Public Land projects might have 8, 10, 12 funding sources that all go towards getting to that purchase price. So here we're going to pause, and the rest of the presentation is kind of walking you through, what does a deal look like? What does a land trust look for? What does the agency realty staff look for in terms of characteristics of the seller and the property and the funding? But I'm going to just pause here and see if there's any questions that we want to address on the planning side of things before we move on.
JT, I don't see any questions in the chat at this time, but if anyone does have a question, please feel free to enter it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and we can ask it.
Sounds great. We'll keep moving then.
Okay.
So you found a property you want to acquire, or you're ready to start acquiring land for your trail. What are you going to look for in a land trust partner? And here I'm not talking about just the Trust for Public Land, but any land trust partner. In general, there's a nice complement to the skill sets between the trail groups and the land trust groups. The land trust groups are typically expert at real estate, and the trail groups are not. And likewise, most land trusts are not expert at trail building and trail maintenance and historic preservation issues. And so there's a nice skill set complement that can happen if you partner up with a land trust, either in a big national like TPL or your local in your service area. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to negotiate with a willing seller and set up a deal and get that landowner to agree to sell their property or the conservation easement or the right of way. And those negotiations can be very tricky and difficult, and it's usually best left to someone who's very familiar with the real estate process. The land trust will oftentimes buy time and hold land off the open market. Most of these funding programs take months or years to play out, and so buying that time is a really critical thing that you need your land trust partner to do. They're really good at setting up a fundraising strategy to meet that purchase price. So securing grants and donations. And that anytime you acquire property or an interest in property, you really want to do your homework. So you're not buying a contaminated property, or you don't know how many acres it is, or you don't know if there's outstanding rights for, power lines or oil drilling or things like that. And so all of that due diligence is a real specialty, but your local land trust or your national land trust partner is going to know how to do that. And then the other thing here is communications. And so sometimes land trusts have different values than the trail groups, and you want to make sure there's alignment and trust. And I really encourage you to build some of these relationships before you're all scrambling to try and acquire a threatened property. If everyone knows each other in advance, you can get to work in a constructive relationship when that opportunity presents itself. Whereas if you're trying to figure out a land deal, a fundraising campaign, and a partnership all at once, it can be a little chaotic. And so having the partnership framework done early with good communication is really key. And that I do this stuff and have been doing it for a long time. The other thing is there's always a twist. Every project seems to die and then come back to life. This is really hard work. Anyone who does land deals is going to tell you war stories about how this one almost got away and it came back, or why that one ended up being just a disaster. This is just really hard work. Dealing with the unexpected is just part of the process. And then the final steps are, to get to the closing, recording that deed. And that once you do that, we like to share success. We like to give credit where credit is due, thank our donors, thank our partners, thank the trail partner. Ribbon cuttings are really fun. And so when we're going through and looking at a real estate project, a land trust or a trail group has brought an opportunity to a land trust, we start asking a lot of questions about the parcel and the value associated with that parcel. And it's all sort of geared towards, are we going to be successful in securing the money and doing this? Is it worthwhile? Is it a fundable project? The key is, what's the value to the trail? I mean, for the Trust for Public Land, where we have said trails are important, that's part of our mission, usually that's a very easy sell. But if you're dealing with a group that's all about biodiversity, a trail might actually be a problem rather than an asset. What are the value to the community and other stakeholder groups? So we oftentimes think about serving the trail and serving the community. We want to do both. And the more people who care about a property, the better. The more people are willing to write a letter of support or open their checkbook is going to really matter as to how much risk we're willing to take and how successful we think we'll be with a multi-year fundraising campaign. Having an economic story is really key. Knowing how it's going to drive tourism, how your trail really impacts the local economy is important. Or sometimes it's about keeping the land in an agricultural use or a forestry use instead of having it converted to a subdivision. Those stories about jobs and economics can be really powerful, especially as you're trying to secure public grants. Habitat, ecological value is important, clean water. There's consistent polling that says that people are more willing to put up money to protect water than almost any other value. So if you're working on protecting people's drinking water, that's a great sales pitch for that local community member or that local, government entity. They may not care about your trail, but they're going to care about the clean water they drink. And if there's ways to combine multiple storylines into one project, that's the key to success. Cultural resources, obviously, for the National Historic Trails, you've got a historic resource there, almost by definition, and those are important stories too. And figuring out when you can tell them and when you can't is sometimes tricky, and we understand that. We can respect confidentiality, but the key is you got to find a hook. When we get into a deal, we obviously have to deal with the seller, with the landowner, and we ask a bunch of questions. Who is it? What's motivating them? Are they really a willing seller? We don't do forcing people to sell their land. And that part of it is also, do they have a realistic value expectation? We can only pay what the land is worth as determined by an independent appraisal. A lot of people think their land is really special, and we have to always have a guidepost of an independent appraisal to make sure that we're offering a fair price. And if the landowner just has an inflated sense of value, there's oftentimes not much we can do. We're usually pretty good about educating people and sort of giving them the reasons why, but we have to be convinced that we're not on a wild goose chase. And then we'll look at the landowner's records and look at the property itself to make sure there's no obvious problems. I mean, I've walked out into properties that have junkyards and said, no way, we just can't buy this thing. It's never going to work. And then the last thing is the timing. These are typically long projects. So a property owner might decide that they're ready to sell, and we come in and we say, we'd like to buy, but it's going to be 2.5 years. That's a pretty unusual offer. When you go to sell your house, if someone said, I'd like to buy it and close in 2.5 years, you'd probably say no. But in this case, that's usually the typical offer that we're making to a landowner, and having someone who's patient is really important. And we sort of look at these through a risk management lens. If we get involved, are we likely to be successful? How much money do we have to spend in order to get to the finish line? Are there things about the property that are going to prevent the federal agency or the local government agency from closing. And so we look at things like, are there buildings? Will the Park Service acquire land with buildings on it? Well, they're looking harder and harder at that. And infrastructure can be a real barrier to getting a project through. We might have to be prepared to tear that building down ourselves. Environmental hazards, again, like I bought a property that had an old copper mine on it once, and that was a nightmare, and I will never do that again. So those are things that we look for. We also don't show up with all the money. We usually have to raise the money along the way. So we will build out a budget and work through a funding feasibility, and that's the money to buy the land, but it's also the money to cover our time and expenses. And that's our staff time, our travel, our overhead, and our opportunity cost. We can only do so many things when we want to be doing the most important work out there. And so if a project is just sort of a ho-hum project, we might take a pass and work on the more important things. All that due diligence, the appraisal, the title investigation, the surveying, is tens of thousands of dollars. Sometimes it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's especially if you're going to a federal agency, there are really, really high standards to make sure everything is sort of done the right way, sort of the gold standard. The appraisal process is something that is nightmarishly hard to get through. And we know that, and having all that experience allows us to sort of look around the corner and see the problems that might be ahead. And we'll be really good at evaluating that, but so will your local land trust. So where does that money come from? Sometimes landowners are willing to, give a gift back or give a bargain sale. There may be, philanthropy within the community, foundations, corporations, just individuals. We look to all of that, and we really like to do that in partnership. We're really big on joint fundraising campaigns with our trail partners so that we can cover our costs, we can cover the cost of the land, and the trail partner can cover their costs as well, and we recognize that. So by doing a joint campaign, it can be really successful. And then if we do end up in the situation where we have to acquire a property and hold it for a period of time, we have to build in the carrying costs. So that's property taxes, that's interest, sometimes keeping the land in a forest status for tax purposes. You have to hire a forester and write a management plan. There's all kinds of things that can come up. And so we build all of this into our financial model and our risk evaluation. And then assuming you're going to do, a federal acquisition, LWCF is almost always going to be the anchor funding source. And there's been great news in the last year with the passage of the America's Great Outdoors Act. So this is a law that many of the trail groups worked really hard on. We worked really hard on at the Trust for Public Land. And it has created a permanent pot of money of $900 million a year that comes from offshore oil and gas revenues and goes back into land conservation. And there's a split amongst the federal agencies and then the state side of that program. But it used to be that we would have to fight every year to make sure that that program was funded. And now it's a guarantee under the America's Great Outdoors Act. So that's a breakthrough. So there's a lot of new money in the system that's really exciting. We still want to talk to our agency leadership and talk to Congress about the projects that we have in line. The trail groups are really good about organizing through American Hiking Society and Hike the Hill Week. There's the Lwcf Coalition, which is sort of a big umbrella group of all the people working on federal conservation issues. And that it used to be in the really old days that there were things called earmarks, and then they went away for about a decade, and now they're back as a sort of a kinder, gentler thing of no longer being called an earmark. It's a community project funding request from a member of Congress. And there are ways that a member of Congress, your local senator or representative, can actually put in a request for a land acquisition through LWCF where the Congress would direct the spending as opposed to the federal agency would direct the spending. This is a brand new development. We're not quite sure how it's all going to work, but it's another avenue. And it's, for really popular projects that have supportive members of Congress, it can be sort of a breakthrough opportunity. So as the Congress works on the budget and the federal agencies work on the budget, there will be a final list of projects that gets published, and you want to be on that list. But there's also some agency discretion. So the rec access funding is a sub-account of LWCF that allows the agencies to buy parcels that are going to open up recreational access, oftentimes for hunting and fishing, but also for trail. And so there's opportunities to get into the federal process through multiple avenues. But the really great thing about LWCF is it picks up 100% of the cost of the land. So you don't have to go into one of these fundraising campaigns for the acquisition costs. The fundraising campaign just becomes about the transaction costs, the staff time and the due diligence and things like that. So when you're working directly with LWCF, those are really good projects to have, because rarely do we find 100% coming from one source. And Joe, you're going to talk a little bit about the steps that the agency goes through to do due diligence. And you're on mute. Joe, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks, JT. Yeah, I'm sorry. Once we agree we're going to buy this thing, so we take it in our office and we have to start this process. And I'll say it a few times here. JT's already alluded to it kindly, actually, that how long it takes to do this in a federal process. It's not quick. It's a very deliberate process, and it does take some time. So the first thing we'll start with, and then we're assuming this is an acquisition, not a donation. So we need a title report for each tract to be purchased. So that's the first step, because we want to find out if there's a fatal flaw in that title that would prevent the federal ownership. It could be just a myriad reasons for that. It could be multiple liens or contested ownership. A lot of stuff and we'll find that out early once we get a title report. And then we would have to go get an attorney. And this goes for both Forest Service and Park Service. So if you have a trail that's USDA, they also go through similar steps. They're called different things, different forms, but it's all the same thing. We all have to get a title, and we have to get an attorney to look at that title to give us an opinion that this is a good, clear title and it can be acquired. So that's the first step. And then we get into this appraisal process. And, this is incredibly complicated. So it has to be done to what's called Yellow Book standard. It's USPAP. It's a federal acquisition standards for an appraisal. So it's not just, as JT mentioned, it's not just a quick appraisal. This takes forever. It takes realistically, if we have to do the appraisal ourselves, the federal government, really you're looking at a year before we can get an approved appraisal back in our hands to make an offer. Now there is one way to speed this up. If you have what we call a third party, third party appraisal process, that's where an outside group would agree to pay for the appraisal. So for example, if we were going to work on a property in Maine on the Appalachian Trail, and JT came and said, I could get this appraisal started, we're willing to pay for the appraisal. So that would speed it up by 6 months or 4 months. Probably, significant amount of time is if the nonprofit would agree to pay for the appraisal. It's still the same appraisal to Yellow Book standards. It's approved and reviewed by the department, but it just gets it past our contracting process. That's the real delay. To contract with an appraiser federally, it takes quite a bit of time. So you could go through what's called a third-party appraisal process and speed that up by many months. And then we need other, and some of these steps happen concurrently. You're not waiting on one while you start the other. So, you might need a survey. We don't really need a survey to acquire land. We prefer that now, to have a survey of each parcel. But, you don't want to go, if it's like a 2,000 acre piece of land in Maine, you don't want to go appraise that at great expense and then realize you don't have the money's not enough and you don't have a willing seller, and then you've just wasted, tens of thousands. So JT's figured out actually an excellent way around that, where we could do a kind of a quick survey in advance that's not to federal standards, not marked and monumented, but it gets you where you need to be. So a survey is part of that. And then we also need an environmental site assessment, a phase 1 environmental site assessment, or most people know this as a hazmat report. That takes probably about 4 months. You don't do that until you know you got a deal. So once that comes later in the process, and if we time it right, that's not a big problem waiting for that, because we know there are many steps along the way here that we're not going to go into, because it's just, detail of this whole process of how we go through this. But we will, environmental site assessment has to take place. We have to get that approved by the region that says there's no problem. There's, JT's junkyard's not hidden out there under pine trees or weeds. So we're not going to buy something that's contaminated. And then we move on to closing. Now, I sped through this list, but I do want to reemphasize one more time is that really one of the first steps in this process, if it's, for example, the Appalachian Trail, we have to have a memo from the superintendent telling us that she wants this piece of land. So you have to get that buy-in from the supervisor, the very first step that says to go ahead and proceed to acquire this land. So that's first. We get that part of the process done. We know that the manager wants to own this or manage this in the future, so we have their buy-in, and then we would take off doing all these steps. Now, again, some of these we don't have to wait on one to get the other, so we'll move on all these in different steps. But all of this stuff together, once we get all these various approvals and contracting, we have to get an outside contractor to pay to perform a phase 1 site assessment for us. So there's contracting steps in here, approvals. We could time all that stuff once we know that we have a willing seller and we have a deal, once we get an offer. So and again, if you're willing to help by paying for an appraisal and contracting with an appraiser to provide that work to federal standards, that can speed this process up by 4 to 6 months. But if not, we could proceed, and it depends on the time of year you start this, when you initiate the appraisal process, because the federal fiscal year ends September 30th of every year. And we have a contracting kind of a stop that varies, and it changes every year. But if you come up in maybe, let's say in July, and say you want to do an appraisal, you have to wait, because that contracting period has been closed to the end of the fiscal year. So you're going to sit and wait until October 1st to even submit that and get it moving. So there, you're looking at about a year for federal appraisal. If you could speed it up, if you're willing to help us, by 4 to 6 months. So quite a process. It's not rocket science. It's not that hard, but it is very time consuming, and all these check marks have to be completed before we can move to closing.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And just one technical mention: the Yellow Book is not the book when it was first published had a yellow cover. So if you Google Yellow Book, it will actually take you to the right definition. But it's a fancy it's shorthand for the long acronym for federal compliant appraisals. So all right, so you've gotten the flavor for this. Is a long process, it's expensive, there's a lot of things to worry about along the way. This is why the nonprofit land trusts exist, is to help get through all of these hoops and hurdles. So we at the Trust for Public Land love to sort of show up on the scene and be the heroes that can trim a year or more off this acquisition process and work with a willing seller landowner and keep them at the table and keep them from getting frustrated. And so that role that we play is really valuable in that, without someone to pay for the appraisal, or without someone to hold a landowner in a contract, or to get this due diligence process kicked off, opportunities for important properties can slip away. And that's really the advantage of having a nonprofit land trust partner like Trust for Public Land or any of them. I mean, there's a lot of people who do what we do. With that comes the costs, and sometimes that's not worth it. You know, sometimes we can't raise that money, or people aren't willing to be philanthropic, and that's a constraint for us. But we've had really good success working on the national trails. There tend to be really home run type properties, and we love the partnership with the trail organizations. And again, joint fundraising is the way out of that. So we would love to work with you to raise money for our acquisition costs, and for a trail relocation, or for better parking, or for your staff time, and do it in a collaborative way. And this is something that I think we're not doing enough of, but there's real opportunities for the land trust community and the trail community to come together and both get something that we can be really proud of. So that's the pitch. We've got plenty of time for questions, and I'm certainly interested in hearing more about opportunities out there. We are nationwide, and I can do referrals on any of the trails to one of our local offices. If you've got a need for an acquisition partner, you know, we would love to play more of a role in the national trail system.
Great. Thanks, JT and Joe. We do have a couple questions here in the chat. Matt Davis asks, when will more details come out about the community project funding process?
So there is information that's been published by the House and I believe the Senate. And what we expect is that the proposals for projects are happening right now. The deadline may have even just closed. This first year, they're going to be capped at $500,000, and each member of Congress can only request, I think it's like 7 or something like that. And that's across all of the federal programs. So transportation and Department of Defense and Interior, everything like that. But a $500,000 request can go a long way. So if you want to start putting project ideas in front of your member of Congress, follow up with me and we can, you know, give you a little education about how that's happening. And it could also happen for some trail building type stuff too. I mean, if you're going for a grant money through Department of Transportation or something like that, those sorts of programs would be eligible as well.
Great. Yeah. Christopher Dowes asks, how do you handle titles that have unconstitutional or otherwise illegal covenants, such as racial discrimination covenants? Can those covenants get cleaned from the titles?
All right, GT.
Yes, with difficulty. So there are ways to clear title. It really depends upon what the issue is and who we're working with. I would not let that be a barrier unto itself. There's always a way, and the specific circumstances are going to be totally inform, you know, what the solution is. But oftentimes it means tracking down the party who put in place those covenants or the party who holds them now and getting a release. And if it's flat out unconstitutional, you know, the agencies may just be willing to overlook it, but it really is very circumstance driven. And Joe, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
I would agree with what you said. Yeah, and sometimes even state law. There's some state laws out there also that cancel that stuff. So it varies, but that stuff could go away. That's not a killer. You know, yeah, proceed. If you have something like that in a title, don't let that scare you away. You could, you know, at least take a further look. And when we do what we call we get a title, we send it to an attorney, what's called a PTO, preliminary title opinion. And that is a way that a federal attorney looks at that title and tells us what to do. So we'll get an opinion back that says, you can do this, this, and this, and then you could proceed to acquire the land. So that the instructions for us would come from an attorney, a solicitor, or general counsel to tell us what to do to clear that title.
Great. And we have one more question here in the chat from Ron Tipton. It's a question for JT. Last year, the NPS DOI decided to require LWCF projects to be reviewed by the existing interagency review board. In the past, that board only reviewed construction or maintenance projects. Do you think an additional layer of review is necessary at the end of the land acquisition process? And given how fast properties are being sold these days, are you concerned about the additional delay?
Yeah, Ron, that's a great question. So yes, we are concerned. And so basically to help people understand what's going on here. So if a property has a building or an improvement on it, there's extra levels of review at the National Park Service. And so we are dealing with a few cases right now where we are buying properties, particularly at historic sites, national historical parks. And whenever you're working in and around, a historic area, you're going to find, buildings, underground pipes, things like that. And we're finding that the extra review is hitting us late in the process and causing disruptions. And so it's something we're just sort of coming to grips with now, but it's something that I'm very worried about. I don't mind the level of review. It's a fair question to ask, but I want to find ways that we can vet that earlier in the process instead of at the last minute as we're like thinking we're getting ready to close. And then all of a sudden, in at least one case in Mississippi, we had an underground pipe has completely caused an acquisition to grind to a halt. And so those are not good situations to be in.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, JT, that we are, so that the Park Service particularly are seeing that is becoming more of an issue. It always was an issue if you had a building or any sort of improvement, but now they're really looking at that. I wouldn't say it's impossible to get something with an improvement, but it is getting very difficult to be able to proceed with an acquisition if it has any kind of an improvement, an old barn, even a house, anything like that. It's going to be tough. That's why in the beginning of this process, you have to get that early approval from a superintendent and explain. And part of what they do is that LARS process that we mentioned, that land acquisition ranking system, is there's a whole section on there about improved land, and it hurts your score. So that's always been a big part of this, but it is rapidly getting even more difficult to even think it's possible to acquire something with an improvement.
And just one last thing, again, just sort of like if you've got a title issue, don't let that scare you. If you've got a building, don't let that scare you either. It just may be that we need to build into the project budget that the land trust partner has to tear the building down and restore the site. I mean, there's a solution to all these problems. Usually it's just money and time. And the more we know about what the hurdles are ahead, the more we'll build that into our scope of work and our fundraising goal and things like that. So again, if you've got a target parcel and you're thinking, oh my gosh, there's an old shed on it, don't worry about that. But let us know that there's a shed, and we can, look at costs for demolition and restoring sites and things like that. And if we know on the front end, we can come up with a plan. It's a very knowing the rules and knowing where the obstacles are. It takes years of experience, and generally our staff, can have a way to kind of look at a situation and figure steps we might have to go through, but we can usually figure out a workaround.
Okay, great. We do have a couple more minutes. Let me see here. If anyone would like to take themselves off mute and ask it or enter anything else into the chat, you are welcome to do that in the last couple minutes we have. If not, I'm going to just close our session for today. And just say thank you everyone so much for attending today's webinar about land acquisition resources. And a special thank you to our presenters today, JT Horn from the Trust for Public Land and Joe Sobinovsky from the National Park Service. I will be working with the presenters to send any follow-up information, and we will send you a recording of this session as well. And I just wanted to let everyone know as well that within this webinar series about land acquisition, PNTS has a second upcoming webinar called Land Acquisition 102. It's going to be on Wednesday, June 2nd at 3 p.m. And you will hear from Miriam Maisel, Deputy Chief at the National Park Service, Jenny Katz at the National Park Foundation, and Reggie Hall, Director of Conservation Loans with the Conservation Fund. These presenters will discuss some additional resources and funding opportunities to help advance land acquisition projects. And they will provide some tips to help you prepare for projects and work with federal agency and nonprofit partners. And finally, just please follow PNTS on social media to keep in contact with what we're doing and any upcoming events. And thank you all again. Thank you so much, JT and Joe. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.